Welcome to the IVF Journey with Dr. Michael Chapman, the podcast for couples who struggle with infertility and want to fulfill their dreams of becoming parents. In this podcast, you'll learn actionable strategies to deal with infertility from Dr. Michael Chapman, or Prof as he's affectionately known. Prof is the co-founder of IVF Australia and is a leading Australian infertility specialist who has helped over 3,000 couples realise their dreams of becoming parents. To access previous episodes packed with ideas, solutions and tips that actually work, head over to Dr. Chapman's IVF podcast on iTunes. You can also ask questions by contacting Dr. Chapman's rooms on 1-800-111-483 or by emailing him michael.chapman@ivf.com.au.
That first cry of a baby born after the long journey of IVF remains one of the most beautiful experiences in the world. As an obstetrician and an IVF specialist, I've had the privilege of experiencing this over many thousands of times in my long career, but I still remain moved by each baby's first cry. It signifies the end of a long journey and the beginning of a new life. This is Professor Michael Chapman, co-founder of IVF Australia and host of the IVF Journey podcast. Thanks for tuning in. To access all the previous episodes, head over to my website, www.theivfjourney.com, and select IVF Journey Podcast from the navigation menu. You'll also be able to find the various services that we provide at IVF Australia. Today we're going to talk about some of the controversies that we face in IVF at the moment. Questions that you might want to ask your doctor as to what they think is the best way to do things. So we'll start with the debate as to whether you should have an embryo put back on day 2 or 3, the cleavage stage as it's called, or whether the embryo should be grown on until day 5 to become a blastocyst. For the first 30 years of IVF, cleavage stage embryos were the ones that got put back. That laboratory culture medium, the incubators, were of a standard that meant the embryo was probably better off inside the uterus after day 3 than in the laboratory. We know that success with cleavage embryos in the best circumstances is around 15% live birth per transfer of a single cleavage stage. If we put 2 embryos back, it climbs to 25%, but we end up with a twinning rate heading up towards 20%. This is far from ideal, and we try and avoid twins because of their complications. And so single embryo transfer is what we endeavour to do. The cleavage stage embryo will fail more commonly than a blastocyst because although an 8-cell embryo may look like another 8-cell embryo, in fact, it never grows forward. So the advantage of going forward and growing them for another 3 days is that those cleavage stage that would never have made it even inside the womb will not grow on, and we can differentiate, therefore, the best embryo. They'll become a blastocyst. For every 5 cleavage stage embryos, we can expect 1 or 2 good blastocysts. That's normal. But those 1 or 2 blastocysts have a much higher chance of a pregnancy. A single blastocyst transferred in a woman under 38 has an over 30% chance of a live birth. You can see that that's doubled a cleavage stage transfer. So in these days where we are putting only 1 embryo back in about 85% of all transfers, putting a blastocyst have an advantage on a cycle basis per cycle. Obviously, if we put cleavage stage embryos back month on month on month, the good embryo that we saw grow in the laboratory to a blastocyst will eventually get its chance. And so the cumulative pregnancy rates between a blastocyst and a cleavage stage program probably are not much different. However, in a cleavage stage program, patients will be going through many more cycles, month on month, to achieve that same pregnancy rate. Some critics of the blastocyst culture system would say that we still haven't got a culture system that guarantees we're as good as the in utero environment. And they might be right, but in 95% of cases, we're almost certain that the right thing has occurred by growing them on to a blastocyst. Some clinicians will still undertake a cleavage transfer even though they've got a good blastocyst program. They do this on the basis of that 5% that I've just mentioned, that if you have a patient who only has one cleavage stage embryo, there is an opinion that that should be put back into the uterus to give it the best possible chance. On the other hand, if it was an embryo that wasn't going to grow to a blastocyst, the patient is put through 2 weeks of waiting, probably for no gain. Randomized controlled trials have yet to prove what the best approach to this type of situation. So today, as I said, certainly in Australia, the vast majority of clinics are now have moved to blastocyst. The next controversy, and again, this is pretty much resolved, is the type of stimulation that should be undertaken in an IVF cycle. Through the 1990s, almost all cycles were called the long protocol. In this type of protocol, treatment began in the 3rd week of the cycle before the egg collection cycle, either with a nasal spray or injection of a substance that switched off the pituitary gland and therefore switched off ovarian function. Then, when a period came, the injections to stimulate egg growth began to be given. The FSH injections on a daily basis to grow the eggs. By the time the eggs were collected, some 3 weeks or more had elapsed from the beginning of the cycle. In the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, now 15 years ago, a new product came along called a GnRH antagonist, compared with the previous GnRH agonist in the long cycles. So the antagonist allowed us to get that down regulation that we wanted, but within the cycle of treatment when the eggs would be collected. So the cycle is a shorter cycle. This gained significant support from patients because obviously the shorter the cycle, the less the burden of injections and the burden of waiting. It took some time to demonstrate that the antagonist cycle, the short cycle, was as good as the long down regulation cycle. But by 2010, this had been clearly shown that there was no inferiority. And indeed, there were some benefits using the short protocol in terms of the incidence of hyperstimulation syndrome. So in Australia today, 85% of all cycles are short antagonist cycles. There are, however, still some clinicians who believe that the long cycle gives good results and they've stuck with their old habits. It's also useful when you're trying to program patients. The advantage of the long down regulation is that you can decide when to start the FSH and so get some better idea about when you're going to do the egg collection. So fitting that into a schedule is easier with a long down regulation protocol. However, the long down regulation protocol has the disadvantage of a major advance that's occurred in the prevention of hyperstimulation syndrome. By giving a different trigger in an antagonist cycle, we virtually eliminate any risk of hyperstimulation. In a long cycle, you can't use that medication. It doesn't work, and therefore hyperstimulation remains an issue. So they're the reasons why most people have chosen to move across to an antagonist cycle. Patient preference because it's shorter and the reduced risk of hyperstimulation syndrome. The next controversy we're going to talk about is whether embryos should be frozen altogether and no fresh transfer occur, or whether we should put back a fresh embryo in every cycle. This is called freeze-all versus fresh. And that debate has been going on now for some 5 years. It became a possibility as the freezing technology improved. The vitrification technology is hugely better than the old slow freeze, particularly for blastocysts. The early work suggested that frozen blastocysts were as good as fresh transfers in terms of pregnancy rates. Then, in 2012, an American study, albeit a small study, randomized patients to fresh or freeze-all. And what happened in that small study of less than 100 patients is that the freeze-all group had a significantly higher pregnancy rate. In fact, they abandoned the study because the difference was so great. Since then, a number of other studies, all fairly small, have not confirmed that difference. So controversy remains. A recent study done in Asia, in Vietnam, of over 800 patients comparing fresh and frozen showed no difference in pregnancy rates. So maybe there's an advantage, but possibly there's not. It certainly doesn't appear to be a disadvantage. And increasingly, there are reasons why we would do a freeze-all. There is no doubt that the lining of the womb in a fresh cycle where multiple follicles produce high levels of estrogen results in an abnormally thickened endometrium. Endometrium is the lining of the womb. So that thickened lining may not be ideal in terms of an embryo attaching and growing. Thus, the concept of freeze-alls is that the endometrium of a natural cycle is going to be better to allow implantation to occur. Again, I would say that there is no disadvantage, but as yet I'm personally not convinced there's a huge advantage. There are groups of patients now that need freeze-all. The first of those that are going to have genetic diagnosis on their embryos because it takes longer than overnight with the current technologies to get an embryo tested to put back the following day. So we freeze all the embryos as a routine. The next group are those at high risk of developing hyperstimulation. And in those patients, we use a different trigger and freeze all the embryos to reduce the chances of hyperstimulation. We're much more confident now with vitrification that we're doing no harm to the pregnancy rate by adopting this strategy at a lower threshold than we did in the past. And the last group is where during the stimulation phase of the cycle, the blood tests show that the progesterone level, which should be low until after egg collection, has become higher than we would like. That rise in progesterone has an impact on the lining of the womb. It starts to make the lining of the womb mature early, which means by the time that an embryo, a blastocyst, is ready to be put back, the endometrium is ahead of itself. And so that asynchrony, that mismatch, will interfere with the chances of pregnancy. And the evidence is pretty clear that if you have an elevated progesterone on the day of trigger, you're halving the pregnancy rate from that cycle. So many of us now are freezing embryos in that situation. So there are real reasons to do freeze-alls. But there is also a growing view that perhaps freezing all is better than fresh. And some clinics in Australia have actually moved to 80 or 90% of their cycles being freeze-all, not for any specific reason other than potentially a slightly better pregnancy rate. We await the studies to prove that that's the right way, but it's certainly doing no harm. So that's 3 areas of IVF which currently are being discussed, sometimes even heatedly, at our conferences, and the medical team that you'll come across may have specific views in relation to each of those, but for each of them there's an argument that will still continue until we get proper randomised controlled trials to tell us the truth. And don't forget that you can access all the previous episodes by going to our website www.theivfjourney.com and select IVF Journey Podcast from the navigation menu.
Thank you for listening to the IVF Journey with Dr. Michael Chapman, the podcast which helps couples negotiate their way through the IVF journey, all the way to parenthood. You can also ask questions by contacting Dr. Chapman's rooms on 1800 111 483 or by emailing him michael.chapman@ivf.com.au.